It is the middle of summer somewhere near a river in ancient Africa, approximately 100,000 years ago. The evening is warm, the air is thick with the specific quality of damp heat that river valleys produce after sundown, when the water releases the warmth it absorbed during the day and the humidity settles over everything like a second skin. The group has eaten. The fire is going. By every measure that matters, this should be a good evening, the kind that ancient human life occasionally produced, where the immediate demands of survival have been met and there is a window of relative ease before sleep. And then it starts. That sound. That specific, targeting, impossibly persistent, high-pitched whine that has been following the human species around since before we were technically a species. The sound of a mosquito that has identified you as its preferred destination and is communicating this decision to you in real time with a frequency specifically calibrated, not deliberately, but effectively, to be maximally annoying to the human auditory system. You slap at your arm. Miss. The sound moves. You slap at your neck. Miss again. Somewhere in the firelight, someone else swears or makes whatever the ancient human equivalent of swearing was, which was almost certainly something extremely expressive, because they are dealing with exactly the same problem. Mosquitoes are not a minor inconvenience in the ancient world. They are, by the body count, the most lethal animal in the history of human existence. The diseases they carry, malaria primarily, but also a range of other vector-borne illnesses, have killed more humans than every war, every famine, and every other predator combined. In ancient Africa, in the river valleys and wetland environments that ancient humans regularly inhabited because those environments were rich in food and water resources, mosquitoes were as constant and as dangerous a presence as any predator the ancient world contained. So how did ancient humans deal with them? What strategies, technologies, and accumulated knowledge did they develop across hundreds of thousands of years of coexistence with the most lethal insect on Earth? The answer is more sophisticated, more creative, and more medically relevant than most people have ever thought to consider. Let's start with the biology of the relationship, because understanding it properly changes how you think about both the mosquito problem and the ancient solutions to it. Mosquitoes have been co-evolving with primate populations, including the ancestors of modern humans, for millions of years. The malaria parasite Plasmodium, which mosquitoes of the genus Anopheles carry, has been infecting the ancestors of modern humans for so long that specific genetic adaptations to malaria are among the most strongly selected for variants in the human genome. The sickle cell trait, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, Duffy antigen negativity. These are genetic variants that confer partial protection against specific malaria parasites, and their presence at significant frequencies in populations with historical high malaria exposure is direct genetic evidence of the selection pressure that mosquito-borne disease has imposed on ancient human populations across enormous time spans. This genetic evidence tells us something important. The mosquito malaria pressure was not occasional or manageable without biological adaptation. It was severe enough and sustained enough to drive genetic change in ancient human populations, to make specific protective genetic variants sufficiently advantageous that they spread through populations despite, in the case of sickle cell trait, carrying their own significant health costs in homozygous form. This is evolutionary biology's way of recording how serious the problem was. But genetic adaptation to mosquito-borne disease takes many generations to express at the population level and does not protect individuals in any absolute sense. Ancient humans needed behavioral and technological solutions that operated at the timescale of individual lives and individual nights, not the timescale of population genetics. And they developed them. Let's talk about fire first, because fire was the first and most fundamental mosquito management technology in the ancient human toolkit. Smoke from a wood fire repels mosquitoes. This is not folk belief. It is documented entomological fact. Mosquitoes locate hosts through a combination of carbon dioxide detection, heat sensing, and olfactory recognition of specific chemical compounds produced by human skin and breath. Smoke disrupts these detection mechanisms by masking the chemical signals mosquitoes use to navigate toward hosts and by the direct irritant effect of smoke particles on mosquito respiratory systems. The specific repellent effectiveness of smoke varies by fuel type. Some woods produce smoke with more effective mosquito repellent properties than others, a fact that is documented in traditional communities worldwide, and that ancient humans with detailed knowledge of their local plant materials would almost certainly have known and exploited. Several plant species produce volatile compounds in their smoke that are specifically effective at repelling mosquitoes. Citronellol compounds from various grasses and herbs, eucalyptol from eucalyptus-type plants, and compounds from various aromatic woods. Ancient humans sitting around fires in mosquito-rich environments were not just incidentally benefiting from smoke. There is every reason to believe they were actively managing their fires in ways that maximized the smoke's repellent effect. This would have included choosing specific fuel materials for their smoke qualities in addition to their heat-producing properties, positioning themselves in the smoke column to maximize coverage of exposed skin, and maintaining fires through the night specifically because the absence of fire was the difference between a manageable mosquito presence and an overwhelming one. The maintenance of fire through the night in ancient sleeping groups served multiple simultaneous functions: warmth, predator deterrence, social lighting. But in mosquito-rich environments, its role in mosquito management was almost certainly among its most critical functions. The ancient communities that maintained continuous night fires in river valley and wetland environments were making a specific investment in mosquito management that had direct health consequences. Now let's talk about plant-based repellents, because this is where the evidence of ancient botanical knowledge applied to mosquito management becomes genuinely remarkable. The use of plant-derived mosquito repellents in traditional cultures worldwide is so widespread and so consistent that it represents clear evidence of ancient independent discovery rather than cultural diffusion. The specific plants used vary by region, because the repellent-producing plant species available vary by region. But the underlying principle is universal. Certain plants produce volatile compounds that mosquitoes find aversive, and humans in mosquito-rich environments discovered this and exploited it. The most common application methods in traditional societies are direct skin application of crushed plant material, burning of specific aromatic plants near sleeping areas, and wearing or carrying specific plant materials on the body. All three of these methods are low technology enough to have been available to ancient humans, and all three are effective in ways that have been documented in modern laboratory testing. Several plant compounds have been identified as effective mosquito repellents in scientific testing, and their natural sources overlap significantly with plants available in ancient human environments. Lemon eucalyptus oil, from plants in the eucalyptus family widespread across ancient African environments, has demonstrated repellent effectiveness comparable to low concentrations of DET in some studies. Neem oil, from the neem tree widespread across ancient South Asian and African environments, has documented mosquito repellent and larvicidal properties. Various members of the basil family produce volatiles, primarily eugenol and other phenolics, that are effective mosquito repellents. Wild mint species produce menthol family compounds with well-documented repellent properties. Ancient humans living in environments rich in these plants, with the detailed botanical knowledge that ancient ecological expertise produced, would have had both the access to and the observational basis for exploiting these plants' repellent properties. An ancient woman who noticed that the plants she was crushing for food preparation left a residue on her hands that she was not subsequently bitten through, and who followed that observation to its practical application, was doing exactly the kind of empirical botanical pharmacology that ancient communities performed in every other domain of plant use. The dental calculus and residue evidence from ancient sites has confirmed that ancient humans were consuming and processing a vast range of plant species, including many with medicinal and functional properties beyond simple nutrition. The specific plants with mosquito-repellent properties were present in ancient environments. The ancient knowledge systems were sophisticated enough to identify and exploit functional plant properties. The mosquito pressure was severe enough to motivate that identification. The inference that ancient humans were using plant-based mosquito repellents is not a leap. It is a reasonable conclusion from well-established premises. Let's talk about campsite selection, because where ancient groups chose to sleep was one of the most important mosquito management decisions they made every day. Mosquito density in natural environments is not uniform. It is dramatically shaped by specific microhabitat features. Standing water, any standing water, from seasonal ponds to river backwaters to the water that collects in hollow trees and large leaves, is essential for mosquito larval development. Mosquito populations are concentrated in the immediate vicinity of their breeding habitat. Moving away from standing water, even by relatively modest distances, produces significant reductions in mosquito exposure. Elevation also matters. Mosquitoes are weak flyers. They are strongly influenced by air movement, and they are less capable of sustained flight against even mild wind. Higher elevation campsites and campsites positioned to take advantage of prevailing breezes experience dramatically lower mosquito exposure than low elevation, sheltered sites in the same general area. Ancient groups with detailed knowledge of their local territories, the kind of intimate, multi-generational landscape knowledge that ancient hunter-gatherers maintained, would have known exactly where in their range the mosquito pressure was most intense, and what the microhabitat features that drove that intensity were. They would have incorporated mosquito avoidance into campsite selection as a routine consideration, alongside the more obvious factors of water proximity, shelter quality, and defensibility. The trade-off between water proximity, which is a resource requirement, and mosquito exposure, which is a health cost, was a real optimization problem that ancient groups navigated continuously. The solutions would have been nuanced, camping close enough to water sources to maintain access, but not directly adjacent to standing water, using elevated or breezy positions when available, and in some cases accepting higher mosquito exposure in exchange for other resource benefits and managing the mosquito problem through other means. The evidence from traditional societies that have maintained ancient-style settlement patterns is instructive. Ethnographic accounts consistently document sophisticated campsite selection practices that explicitly incorporate insect pressure as a decision variable. Ancient groups with comparable environmental knowledge almost certainly operated with comparable sophistication. Let's talk about clothing and physical barriers, because covering exposed skin is one of the most effective mosquito avoidance strategies available, and ancient humans had the means to implement it. The evidence that ancient humans were making and wearing clothing goes back at least 100,000 to 120,000 years. The bone needles, hide-scraping tools, and lice genetics evidence that we have established in previous discussions. Clothing that covers the skin provides a physical barrier to mosquito biting that is directly effective and requires no pharmacological action. In the context of mosquito management, the value of clothing was not uniform across all body regions. Mosquitoes preferentially target areas of exposed skin with high capillary density and thin epidermis. The face, neck, ankles, and arms are typical high-exposure areas. In mosquito-rich environments, ancient humans with access to clothing and the motivation to wear it would have had strong incentive to maintain coverage of these areas specifically. The trade-off between clothing coverage and thermal comfort in warm environments, the conditions where mosquito exposure is often highest, was real and required management. Light, loose-fitting, hide or plant fiber garments that provided coverage without excessive heat retention were probably the optimal solution, and the development of clothing materials and constructions suitable for warm weather use was almost certainly partly motivated by exactly this consideration. There is also the specific application of physical barriers to sleeping environments. The use of plant materials, hides, or other physical barriers arranged around sleeping spaces to create partial protection against mosquito access. Traditional bed structures in many cultures with high mosquito exposure incorporate physical barriers as a primary protective strategy, and the principle is simple enough to have been discoverable and applicable in ancient contexts. Let's address malaria specifically, because the disease context of the ancient mosquito relationship is as important as the pest management context. Malaria is caused by Plasmodium parasites and transmitted exclusively by specific mosquito species. It produces cyclical fever, chills, anemia, organ damage, and in severe cases death, with children and non-immune adults most vulnerable to its worst outcomes. In ancient Africa and other tropical environments where malaria has been endemic for thousands of years, the disease was a constant, significant mortality source. The genetic evidence we discussed earlier, the selection for malaria protective genetic variants in populations with historical malaria exposure, documents the severity of this mortality pressure. But ancient humans also developed non-genetic responses to malaria that are documented in the ethnobotanical record and that have proven to have genuine pharmacological basis. The most extraordinary of these is the use of plants containing artemisinin family compounds for fever treatment. Artemisinin, derived from the sweet wormwood plant Artemisia annua, is the basis of the most effective modern anti-malarial treatments. Sweet wormwood's anti-fever properties were documented in Chinese traditional medicine going back thousands of years, and the plant has been used in traditional fever treatment across multiple cultures. The discovery of artemisinin's anti-malarial mechanism, which won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2015, was explicitly informed by traditional medicine records. The Artemisia family is geographically widespread, with various species available across African, Asian, and European ancient environments. Ancient communities in these regions that developed the empirical knowledge that specific Artemisia species were effective for treating the specific fever pattern that malaria produces, a distinctive cyclical fever with specific characteristics, were discovering something pharmacologically real. They may not have known they were treating a parasite, but they were using a compound that worked, identified through the same process of careful observation and accumulated knowledge that ancient botanical medicine operated on throughout. Other plants used in traditional anti-malarial medicine, neem, cinchona bark containing quinine, and various bitter compound plants whose active ingredients interfere with the Plasmodium life cycle, similarly have genuine pharmacological basis that has been confirmed by modern chemistry. Ancient communities did not develop these treatments by accident or superstition. They developed them by observing that people treated with specific plant preparations recovered from specific fever patterns at higher rates than people treated without them, and transmitting that observation as knowledge. Let's talk about population-level immunity and how it shaped ancient mosquito-malaria relationships, because this is one of the most important and least appreciated dimensions of the ancient picture. In regions where malaria has been endemic for thousands of years, most of tropical and subtropical Africa, parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, living populations develop acquired immunity through repeated exposure during childhood. This immunity is not complete, but it significantly reduces the severity of malaria episodes in adults who survived childhood exposure. Ancient populations in these endemic regions would have had significant acquired immunity to locally prevalent malaria strains by adulthood, making the disease less acutely dangerous for experienced adults than for newly arrived individuals or for children undergoing their first exposures. This partial immunity had important consequences for how ancient communities related to mosquito exposure. Adults with established acquired immunity could tolerate mosquito-rich environments with much lower acute health risk than immunologically naive individuals. Children and adolescents, still building immunity through repeated exposures, were the most vulnerable group in endemic regions. The epidemiological pattern in endemic malaria regions, where children bear the heaviest disease burden and adults are relatively resistant, would have been recognizable in ancient communities, and would have shaped community-level responses to mosquito exposure. The specific protection of children from mosquito exposure, using whatever combination of smoke, plant repellents, physical barriers, and campsite selection the community maintained, would have been prioritized in ancient communities because children were both the most vulnerable and, from a community survival perspective, the most critical to protect. Adults with established immunity could manage higher exposure levels. Children needed more protection while their immune systems built the resistance that would eventually reduce their vulnerability. This age differential vulnerability pattern is documented in traditional communities that maintain high exposure environments and manage them through behavioral adaptation, and it is reasonable to infer a similar pattern in ancient communities navigating the same basic epidemiological situation. Let's talk about one more dimension that rarely gets discussed: the role of camp hygiene and larval habitat management in ancient mosquito control. Standing water near campsites is both a resource for drinking, food processing, and bathing, and a mosquito breeding liability. Ancient communities that maintained campsites in one location for extended periods, during seasons of abundant local resources, during winter camps, or at reliable water sources, were creating conditions that could support mosquito population growth near the camp itself. The management of standing water near campsites, filling in puddles, avoiding the creation of water-holding depressions, removing water-accumulating objects from the immediate camp area, would have been recognizable as mosquito reduction strategy to any sufficiently observant community that had noticed the relationship between standing water and mosquito prevalence. The specific observation that mosquito larvae develop in standing water is one that would have been available to any ancient group that spent time near water sources and paid attention to what was in it. The periodic movement of camps that characterized mobile hunter-gatherer life, moving every few days or weeks rather than remaining in one location, also had incidental mosquito management benefits. A campsite that is occupied briefly does not give mosquito populations time to build up to maximum density in response to the CO2 and heat signatures of the human group. Each new campsite starts with whatever background mosquito density exists there, rather than the elevated density that accumulates around a continuously occupied site. The seasonality of movement in many traditional communities, moving away from water-rich lowland environments during peak wet season when mosquito populations were highest, and returning when conditions improved, represents a sophisticated ecological response to mosquito seasonal population dynamics that ancient communities in mosquito-rich environments almost certainly practiced in some form. Here is the picture that emerges when you put all of this together. Ancient humans were managing mosquito exposure actively, continuously, and with a sophistication that the bare-ground, naive sufferer narrative of ancient life does not capture. They positioned themselves in the smoke column of fires tended specifically for their repellent properties. They applied plant materials to their skin that had genuine pharmacological repellent effects. They selected campsites with awareness of mosquito microhabitat requirements. They used clothing to cover vulnerable skin. They managed standing water near campsites. They moved seasonally to avoid peak mosquito exposure periods. They developed and transmitted botanical knowledge of plants effective in treating the fevers that mosquito-borne disease produced. They did not win completely. Malaria killed ancient humans. The genetics. Evidence for selection on malaria protective variants tells us that clearly. Children died of it. Adults were weakened by it. The accumulated mortality from mosquito-borne disease across the span of ancient human history is incalculable and genuinely terrible. But ancient humans were not passive sufferers. They were active managers of a biological threat that they understood, not in microbiological terms, but in observational, practical, empirical terms, with the depth and accuracy that comes from hundreds of thousands of years of close, attentive coexistence. The woman by the fire who crushed specific leaves and rubbed them on her children's skin before bed, who positioned the sleeping group on the windward side of the fire, who chose this campsite over the lower, damper 300 meters away because of what she knew about where the biting was worst at night. She was not doing magic. She was doing mosquito management with the tools and knowledge available to her. Tools and knowledge that were real, effective, and sophisticated. The mosquitoes were still there. They always were. But ancient humans were not just sitting there getting bitten. They had figured out quite a bit about how to fight back.